Good day, August 2nd, 2020. Welcome to the message today, which comes out of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, specifically Matthew 5, verse 5. Before we begin, I want us to take a little time to reflect and remember our community. It's a small community with a big heart. And so I offer up to God and put in God's care, or remind us that we are in God's care, Selena and Ricky and Barbara and Ann and her family, and Kay and Wade, and Brittany and Peanut and Aaron and Jennifer and me. Oh God, help us to relax into your care. Amen. So the text comes from Matthew 5, verse 5. Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. Mourning is something that we look forward to with great relish. We don't want to mourn or grieve, but it's a very important part of our lives. It's a natural part of our lives, and it's vital to do properly if we ever want to be whole or healed. Back in 2011, my dad died, and for the 2 years prior to his death, I was fortunate enough to be in a position where I could take care of him full time. And that's what I did. Jennifer and I both. We dedicated our lives to taking care of my dad. We took him to hospital. We took him to doctor's appointments. We took him to dialysis 4 times a week. We took care of his medications, his meals, talking with him, supporting him, comforting him, whatever it took. He spent a lot of time in the hospital, more time in hospital than out. He didn't have any kind of appetite. When he was home, Jennifer or I would prepare a meal for him on a diet that he could eat. When he was in hospital, he had no appetite, and he only liked to eat steak from one particular place or chicken gizzards. And we would go every day he was in hospital, we'd go to that one place where he liked steak or another place where he could get gizzards, and we would get it for him. And we'd bring it back to the hospital room for his evening meal, and we'd sit with him and eat with him. And felt like it was a good day if he could eat 1 or really 2 gizzards was incredible, and the same 1 or 2 pieces of steak. He had no appetite. It was emotionally and physically exhausting to be in the hospital from 8 to 12 hours a day, and we did that. That's what we did for well over a year. We were fortunate because I have 2 brothers who were great, and they worked a few hundred miles away, but on the weekends they would come and help us, and they would give Jennifer and I both a much needed rest in their presence, and Dad was thrilled to see them. So that all was good, but it wore us out. And one thing that I knew as a pastor, and that I've known as a pastor, but had not until that time personally experienced it, but I had always been taught it, was how important it is for caregivers to take care of themselves. They need to take care of themselves physically and spiritually, because if they are worn out, for one thing, it's not good for them, but for another, they can't take good care of another person. So I would always teach that if someone was a caregiver in one of my communities and they came to me for advice, I would advise them to go to their doctors and get a full physical and make sure they knew what was going on with their bodies and how they needed to take care of themselves, and also to go to whoever their spiritual mentor was, and on a regular basis, and talk with them and be cared for in that way. It could be their pastor, it could be someone else, but whoever it was, they needed that care. And as much as I've always taught that and stressed the importance of that, I was not good at taking my own advice. I did not get the rest I needed. I had no spiritual guidance, really. I just escaped into taking care of Dad. And when Dad finally died, I didn't know what to do with myself. I had, for all that time, focused entirely on him, and then he was gone. What was I going to do? I had no job. I had no home. And then one of the anchors in my life, my father, was gone. For a few months, we were homeless, technically homeless, but we were fortunate enough that one of my brothers was gracious enough to provide us with a place to stay with him. And during this time, we took about 6 months looking for a place to live. Some of the places we looked at, well, there was a cave in Arkansas. I really wanted that cave. It had a river that ran through the cave. And I went, I thought, wow, it was on 42 acres, this big cave with a big opening. I was going to enclose that opening, and then with that river, or really a creek going through it, we would have natural air conditioning year round. That would have been great, but couldn't afford it. Then we looked at a school building in Nebraska, 22,000 square feet, on just 4 acres, but we just missed it, just missed getting that one. Someone beat us to it. I thought it would be a great artist and writers colony. Then we looked at a funeral home, a Victorian funeral home built in the 1880s. It had never been a home and then a funeral home. It had always been a funeral home. It was built to be a funeral home. And it was on a few acres. And in the 60s, they had built another building, a more modern building nearby, where they did all, the embalming and stuff. And so that left the house just for the viewings and all that. And we wanted to buy it and turn it into a haunted bed and breakfast. But on the day we put our bid on it, the guy I had been speaking with, he wanted to sell it, who owned it, he died, and everything went to escrow, so we missed out on that. So finally we found an old United Methodist Church building in Minnesota, and we bought that, and we moved there. When we were looking for a house, I remember my brother one day saying to me, William, why can't you just be normal? Just look for something normal. But that just sounded so boring. We didn't want anything normal. But we found the place, the old church building in Minnesota, and we, like the Beverly Hillbillies, we packed up our bags and we moved 1,500 miles from the coast of South Georgia to the prairie of Southwest Minnesota. And everybody thought we were crazy. And so I was very active during the time between Dad dying and us moving to Minnesota. I was very active trying to survive, trying to find a place to live, trying to find what kind of work I was going to do, how we were going to make a living, these sorts of things. Very, very, very busy. And since I was so busy, I didn't take the time to properly grieve for my dad. We had a service for him, but that was not the same. I knew I needed to grieve for Dad. I needed to mourn, but I really was avoiding it, purposefully avoiding it. Dad was one of the most influential people in my life. We were very close. We talked every day, always talking about something, planning something, scheming something. And when he was gone, I found myself lost. I didn't know what to do. And I had a lot to get done. How was I going to survive? I told myself I didn't have time to grieve over my dad's death. I was afraid that if I gave into that grief, it would overwhelm me and I would not be able to cope or to get things done that needed to get done. I wouldn't survive, is what I told myself. So I steeled myself not to grieve. I knew better. Especially as a pastor, I've had more courses and seminars and conferences on grief than I can count. I knew the importance and the value of grieving. I knew I wouldn't get better until I properly grieved. I have counseled the wisdom of grieving to countless people because it's the only way toward healing. And yet, I ignored my own wisdom, my own counsel. Why? Why did I do that? I told myself I couldn't dare to grieve because I had too much to do to survive. But in hindsight, I know I wasn't being honest with myself. I knew I wasn't being honest with myself then, but it was a good excuse. It's not really why I wouldn't allow myself to grieve. The reason I didn't allow myself to grieve is because I knew it would be very painful to do so. I didn't want to go through that pain. I'd just been through over a year of intense pain. I couldn't endure any more pain, and so I avoided. And I did have to survive after all. And I worried that if I gave in to the pain, into the grieving, into the mourning, into the regretting, that it would somehow consume me and I wouldn't get out of it. And so I avoided it. And I was wrong to do so. We're all aware of so many grievous things in this world. Right now is one of the darkest times in the world For some, we've got the 20th century was one of the worst centuries in the history of humanity. And then this year has been pretty rough. We mourn and grieve, and we see mournful situations and we look away. When we see a family begging with a sign in the Walmart parking lot, we look away. We can't bear to look. And we tell ourselves, oh, it's a scam. We do that to comfort ourselves. Because we can't bear to think there's a family living on the streets. There are people who are starving to death. As a child, when I wouldn't eat something, my mom would say, there are people starving in Bangladesh, as if that's going to make me want to eat. My response was, well, if they're starving, send them my food. I don't want it. We grieve over war, or if we don't, we need to. There are war-torn nations and war-torn communities and refugees by the tens of millions. And there are going to be refugees by the tens of millions in our own country, with all the people being turned out of their homes now. Tens of millions of people are going to be out of a home. There's sickness with no cure. There's loneliness, poverty, natural disasters that terrorize people and leave them with nothing. Domestic strife and abuse, cruelty to children, cruelty to animals, death. The list could go on. There's a lot to mourn, a lot to grieve about. As one who has spent my life immersed in the Word of God, I know the wisdom of grieving. We must grieve if we are ever hopeful in being whole. Each of us have different ways of trying to understand God and our relationship with God. We tend to think that we know God through ideas such as Bible study, serving others, prayer, worship, music, nature. These are all different methods of connecting with the sacred. However, until you have cried for another person, you don't know God. It's just not possible. As one who has seen the devastation that can be done to persons and communities through emotional manipulation, I've always been skeptical of some emotion, specifically tears, in a community setting. I learned early on, especially in my country churches when I was a younger pastor, I learned that a well-told, good story can elicit tears from the congregation. And when I was a young pastor, I was perplexed when people would come to me after a sermon and say, "That was a great sermon, Pastor. I cried." And I thought, well, why does crying make it great? Sometimes I would ask them that, and they had no response. But it worried me because I had vowed to never use any skills I may have to manipulate people to certain action. Although I vowed it, it's not quite true that I've maintained that vow. There have been times when I've bribed church members in order to have certain things done. Am I proud of it? Not proud of it. Am I ashamed of it? No. One time I saw a great need to feed the hungry in our community, especially the poor children who lived in the projects. And the church where I live was full of a lot of hateful people who just thought that going to church was about them. And they complained all the time about wanting an ice machine because the men in the church liked to go fishing. And they had to go buy their ice, boo-hoo. So I decided, well, you know what? I can write a grant and get y'all a nice $3,500 ice machine to make all the ice you ever want if you'll just open up this building and let the poor come in here and eat. And they agreed to it. So yeah, I manipulated that outcome. Am I ashamed of it? No. But for years as a pastor, I tended to stress the intellect rather than emotion because I feared abusing emotion. It's so easy to abuse and fool people by appealing to their emotion. This has been done so well in our country that people tend to hold the intellectual as suspicious. We have, especially in the church, we have this great mob of people who are suspicious of educated clergy. Why? Especially in politics, we know what appeals to emotion far outweigh good sense. We only have to look at the White House now to see that. However, I have no problem using humor to convey a message, and humor is an emotion. And realizing this caused me to give serious consideration to the validity of other emotions, including tears. And I've come to realize there must be a balance. We are, after all, human. We're all made in God's image. And in Jesus' life, we see that God cries, God mourns for the world. God sheds tears of grief for those in the world who are in pain and who are hurting. God is moved with compassion for people. And that's an emotion. Compassion is Jesus' strong motivation for all that he does. He loves people. And when he sees them hurting, he's moved with compassion to alleviate their pain and to join them in their pain and to shed tears of pain himself. We may think that we know God through ideas, but knowing God and loving people requires tears for the world. We have to cry. We have to cry for the world. We have to grieve. And to do that is to recognize that there's an injustice, that there's something wrong, that things are not as they should be, and that people are hurting. And that's not right. Jesus praises those who cry, those who see the pain of people of the world, that they're enduring great pain, and rather than run away from it for self-preservation, Jesus goes right into the thick of it, entering into solidarity with those in pain. I once lived 1 mile from the gated community known as Chateau Elan, which is north of Atlanta, about an hour. There's a winery there and several golf courses. They have several televised tournaments a year. They have a couple of restaurants that serve excellent food. And when I lived up that way, a couple of the Atlanta Braves lived there. One of the pitching coaches lived there. And he was a member of my congregation. And sometimes he would invite me to meet him at the clubhouse there for lunch. And I would go over there. And it was a gated community. And I had to be able to say at the gate, yes, I'm a guest of so-and-so, before I could go in. And once I was driving around there in my little beat up car, going to meet the pitching coach at the clubhouse, when a young man in an actual Ferrari ran me off the road. And he jumped out of his car and he was red-faced and enraged, and he came stalking over to me. And he started cursing at me and telling me, get the hell out of here. This is not your community. You don't belong here. You need to leave. Quit coming in here and bothering us with your kind. You need to leave and never come back. And I just sat there and listened to him. I was young then and strong. He was young, but I was fairly confident that I could take him. I wasn't really worried about him getting physical with me, not just because I was strong, but also because I happened to have an 18-inch Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun on the seat beside me with a pistol grip and a vented barrel. And I knew it could do a lot of the talking for me. Even though I didn't fear for my life, his words did hurt me, and they saddened me. Here was this young man surrounded by opulence and safety. He had tucked himself away from the world, yet he was still so angry and afraid that the world might creep up on him and somehow taint him, stick to him. The ugliness outside of his gated community might attach itself to him, and he didn't want that. Jesus said it's very difficult for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Why did he say that? Because the rich tend to remove themselves from pain in the world by isolating themselves from those in the world who are hurting. And it's impossible to have a relationship with God when we isolate ourselves from those who are hurting. We don't have to be rich to isolate ourselves. We just have to put what resources we have into play. Whether we live in a gated community or in a house way out in the woods in the country away from everybody else so they can't get to us, it's the same thing. We can hide from people. We can hide emotionally. We can be in a football stadium full of 83,000 people watching the Georgia Bulldogs beat the Georgia Tech. Surrounded by thousands, tens of thousands of people, and be totally alone. We can be at a football game or at Six Flags or somewhere and see a couple of rows over, see someone, maybe a wife or a boyfriend, emotionally abusing their partner. We can see it and we turn away and we say, it's none of my business. But it is our business. Anytime someone in the world is hurting, it is our business. We are a community, beloved by God. And when people are hurting, that is God's business. And as God's agents in the world, it is the church's business. When people are hurting, to love them. And love is an action. It's something you do, not something you feel. We convince ourselves when we see the pain of others, we convince ourselves it's none of our business, and we look away and we shut down our hearts to do it. One of the best places to hide these days is in a church community. We can so easily put on our religion and convince ourselves that we're good people while also ignoring those around us living in pain. Back in the early 1990s, one Sunday after worship, a woman stopped to tell me that there was a young man who had recently moved into the community and he had AIDS. Now, this is the early 90s. AIDS hadn't really been dealt with yet. She told me this young man this young man really needed to know that this little town wasn't a good place for him to be. He just wouldn't be comfortable here. And I needed to go and see him and let him know that this wasn't a good place for him. There were other people around this woman, and they were all shaking their head in agreement. Yeah, Pastor, you need to go see him and tell him that. So what they wanted was for their pastor to go and tell this young man who is gravely ill that he wasn't wanted in town and to encourage him to leave. Get rid of it. That's what they wanted me to do. Now these women were understandably afraid, and they weren't just women, they were men there nodding their heads. Remember, in the early 90s, despite AIDS having been around since 1981, our national leadership had ignored it and let it burn down the population like a wildfire. In fact, just like in our current pandemic, the national leadership in the 80s at first acted like AIDS was a joke, if not real. Look at Ronald Reagan. He was our president then. Look at how he treated the AIDS epidemic all the way up to 1987. Poor leadership leads to growing fear, and these women feared what they did not understand. And like a dutiful little pastor, I went to see this young man, but I didn't go to kick him out. Opening his door to my knock, he seemed shocked to have a visitor. I introduced myself and I held up my hand to shake his hand. And when I did that, when he took my hand, first he looked at me like I had horns growing out of my head. And then I grabbed his hand and we shook, and then he just burst into tears and started crying. And then I thought, what have I done wrong? I've offended him. What did I do? We went into his sitting room and I tried to console him and I apologized for offending him, and he shook his head and he insisted, no, you didn't offend me. No, I'm just shocked that you have shaken my hand. Ever since I've been diagnosed with AIDS, everyone avoids me. No one touches me. No one comes close to me. He said I must not have known he had AIDS, otherwise I wouldn't have offered my hand. And I said, oh, I know you have AIDS. That's why I'm here. You're hurting. You're sick. I came to see if I could do anything for you. This caused him to cry some more. I decided maybe I just need to be quiet. During our visit, he asked if I would like a Coca-Cola, and I said that would be great. And then my heart sank when he went into his kitchen, opened the refrigerator door, and pulled out a 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola. I wasn't prepared for this. At home, we always drink out of cans like this. Never had the 2-liter bottle. The 2-liter bottle always went flat quickly. But of course, this young man, whose name was Jamie, was barely living physically and economically. He had nothing. So he had to buy the cheapest thing he could. In fact, it wasn't even a Coca-Cola. It was a cola. He poured the cola into 2 separate glasses, and even though I knew better, I knew that AIDS was not spread that way, I was still afraid. And I prayed silently for the courage to love him. for him not to see my fear. And when he handed me that glass, I drank that Coke down. I drank it right on down, all the way down, and I slammed it down on the tabletop, and I said, man, that was good. Could I have a little bit more? And he started to cry again. He said he was shocked that I would come to see him, I would shake his hand, and then that I would dare to share a drink with him, a man who had AIDS. I learned his name was Jamie. He was 24 years old. He was 1 year older than I was. I asked him what he needed. He said, all I need more than anything in this world is a friend. I was honored that over the next year, he allowed me to be his friend. One day when the conditions were right, he said he wanted to come and worship with us. But the weather had to be right. Everything had to be right because AIDS, of course, is advanced immune deficiency. And his immune system was down. And if he got a cold, he could die. And the day came, and in the meantime, I had been, with his permission, I had been talking with the congregation and saying he wanted to come and worship with us, and preparing them and educating them on AIDS and how AIDS was spread. I even had a physician come and give a talk. And one day, Jamie came, and he waited until the worship service started, and he heard the music, and he cracked open the door, and he silently stepped into the back door, but he didn't step in silently enough. Immediately, the people started murmuring amongst themselves, that's him, that's him, that's the boy with AIDS, that's him. And immediately, the congregation became very animated, and like a flock of starlings, they all got up as one and moved away from Jamie toward the front pews in the building, leaving him all alone in the back. And Jamie fell down into the seat on the back row all by himself and leaned over and sobbed. And two older women in the congregation who always sat near the front, their names I remember, this is 30 years ago, Sarah and Connie. They got up from their seats near the front and they walked to the back, and one sat on either side of him, and they hugged that young man and they cried with him. When Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan to the people, and in the end of the story, he asked the lawyer in the audience who had asked, who is my neighbor? He asked that lawyer, who, sir, was the neighbor in this story? And the lawyer said, the one who helped the beaten man. And if I was to ask that question today, in the story of the church rejecting a young man who was gravely ill, who loved him? What would the answer be? When we withdraw from people in pain, even if it's for self-preservation, we communicate that we do not love them. We communicate we don't love people in pain when we look away. We reject them. They're not worthy of our gaze. We don't love the homeless person when we cross the street to avoid a panhandler, or even when we're in support of laws that are against begging. We don't love the crying, snotty-nosed child who appears to be lost in the bad part of town running down the street when we turn away and tell ourselves, oh, what horrible parents, but it's none of my business. We don't love the stranger who we stop at our borders with walls and questions, convinced that we have enough pain in our own country and we can't deal with their pain too. We don't love the handicapped reporter who we make fun of his physical condition instead of admiring all that he's overcome. We don't love the stranger we meet in town who is wearing a face mask, but we don't wear one because we know better and we know they're all being fooled. When my middle son, Karis, was around 7 years old, he was deathly terrified of space aliens, aliens that come from outer space. His older brother would make fun of him about it and say things about aliens, and this would cause Karis to be just terrified. And if it was in the evening at bedtime, he couldn't sleep because he was terrified. And in our family, we weren't allowed to say the word alien. That was a bad word. You couldn't say it. We had to call it the A word. And even then you had to be careful. You didn't want Karras to hear you say the A word, because he knew the A word really meant aliens. If anyone said anything about an alien, it would set Karras off. And if anyone said anything about an alien at night, poor guy couldn't sleep. I tried to reason with my son about his fear. I thought it was an unfounded fear. I thought that the likelihood of aliens visiting us on our farm was highly unlikely. But Karras wouldn't be convinced. No matter how much I tried to tell him he didn't have to worry about aliens coming, he wouldn't be convinced. He lived in fear. I told him he could relax. He didn't have to worry about aliens, but he couldn't give it up, and he would just live in fear and in terror. And because I love my son, I wouldn't give up on him. And I finally realized that I would never be able to convince him that he didn't have to worry about aliens, because he was 7 years old. And that's how his mind worked. And he couldn't believe that that was something he didn't have to worry about, because he saw evidence of it on movies, TV, this and that. Aliens were very real to him. And so he had reason to worry. But because I loved him, I didn't want to see him in pain. So I really wondered, how can I help ease his fear, ease his pain? And one day I had an idea, and I bought a can of air freshener. And I painted that can silver, and I sprinkled some glitter on it. And the glitter stuck in the paint. And I now had a can of anti-alien spray. And I printed out a small sheet of paper with instructions on how to use it. And I folded that up, and I put it in the cap of the paint can, and I put the cap on the paint can. And the next day, and then that afternoon, we had dinner. And around dinner, I said, hey, guess what? Guess what I got today? It came in the mail. Finally came in the mail. I've been waiting on it and didn't want to say anything about it until it came in. And they all said, what is it? And I said, I got a can of anti-alien spray right here. Anti-alien spray. I looked at his older brother with darts, laser stares, that if he defied what I said, probably death would come to him, and he understood. I showed him the can. I told him it was special. It came from the government. He had all kinds of questions. How did you get it? I said, well, I have a friend in the government. And the government knows they can never admit that aliens exist, but they have this spray in big containers, and he got me some, and he sent it to me. He believed me. I was his dad. This made sense to him. He always knew aliens were real, so this made sense. He asked me how it worked, and I said I really didn't know how it worked, but it did come with instructions on how to use it. And the instructions, we got them out and read it, and it said simply spray the spray around every opening in the house, every window and every door. Spray it around the perimeter, and aliens will not be able to cross